The laughter started before the wagon had fully stopped. It was a low chuckle from the freight hauler, Davies, a sound that rumbled up from his chest as he set the brake. He looked from the black iron bulk squatting in his wagon bed to the two women standing in the dust beside it. One was a widow, not yet 30. The other was her mother, whose face was a map of 70 hard years. The laughter caught on, spreading through the handful of men idling outside the mercantile. "That's a curious thing to haul all the way from the railhead, Agnes," Davies said, wiping his brow with the back of a dusty glove. He gestured with his thumb at the stove. It was a German design, short and stout, with a rounded top and a small firebox door, unlike the tall, hungry box stoves common to the territory. "That stove will eat more than it heats." Agnes said nothing. She counted out the freight charge into his open palm. The coins were cool from her pocket. Her gaze was steady, fixed on the object in the wagon. It was not a stove. It was a system. She had sold her late husband's repeating rifle and his good saddle to pay for it. The men knew this. It had been a topic of conversation for a week. The sale was foolishness. The purchase was a mystery. Now, the mystery sat before them, a 250-pound punchline. "You'll need 4 men to get that down," the blacksmith offered, though he made no move to help. He leaned against a porch post, arms crossed. Agnes looked at her mother, Martha, whose hands, though gnarled, were clasped with a familiar resolve. "We'll manage." The words were so quiet they were nearly lost to the September breeze. Davies shrugged, pocketed the coins, and climbed back onto his seat. The laughter crested again as he released the brake, a parting volley of communal certainty. The wagon rolled away, leaving the widow, her mother, and the stove alone in the middle of the track. Her 2 children, Samuel and Rose, stood near the cabin door, watching. They were not laughing. They were waiting for instructions. The sun was warm, but a chill rode the edge of the wind, a promise whispered from the north. The laughter stayed behind. The stove was still on the ground. The first task was to get it off the wagon and onto the ground without shattering the cast iron. Agnes had thought this through. She laid 2 thick planks from the wagon bed to the rutted dirt, creating a steep ramp. She had brought grease from the cabin, a small tin of it, and she smeared it liberally along the top surface of the planks. Martha watched, her expression unchanging. She had seen her daughter solve other problems this way, with quiet physics, not brute force. The men were gone, having returned to their porches and storefronts to watch the spectacle from a more comfortable distance. Their stillness was a form of judgment. Agnes climbed into the empty space in the wagon bed beside the stove. She put her shoulder to its cold flank and pushed. It did not budge. It was an anchor, a solid mass of settled iron. She repositioned her feet, bracing them against the wagon sideboards. She pushed again, her breath held tight in her chest. A faint groan of metal on wood, and then nothing. Rose, her daughter, took a few steps forward. "Is it too heavy, Mama?" "It has to be heavy," Agnes said, not looking at her. "That's the point." She looped a rope around the stove's stubby legs, passing the end to her mother. It was not for pulling. It was for guidance. "Just keep it straight," she instructed. Martha took the rope, her knuckles white. Agnes put her back into it, her muscles straining. The stove scraped forward an inch, then another. It reached the edge of the wagon bed and tilted onto the greased planks. For a moment, it balanced there, a precarious weight caught between the wagon and the earth. Then, gravity took over. It slid, not with a crash, but with a controlled, groaning descent, the grease doing its work against the iron's inertia. It came to rest on the ground with a solid thud that shook the dust. It was done. The first part. Agnes stood, breathing heavily, her hands on her hips. Her palms were raw. From the mercantile porch, someone shook their head. The show was over. They had work to do. The next phase of the journey was slower, measured in feet, not yards. The cabin was 50 feet away. Agnes had prepared for this as well. Lying beside the path were 4 round logs, each about 6 inches in diameter, stripped of their bark. Rollers. She and Martha managed to lever one edge of the stove up with a long pry bar, just enough for Samuel to slide the first roller underneath. They did the same on the other side. Now the stove rested on 2 wooden cylinders. Agnes pushed from behind. It moved, rolling forward with a deep, grinding sound. It covered 2 feet of ground before the first roller emerged from the back. Samuel, understanding the geometry of the task without being told, grabbed the freed roller and ran to the front to place it in the stove's path. Rose did the same with the next one. It became a rhythm. A slow, crawling procession. Push. Roll. Retrieve. Replace. The sun climbed higher, beating down on Agnes's back. Sweat soaked the collar of her dress. Martha did not push, but she guided the front, her old hand steering the iron beast, preventing it from veering off its log track. Her contribution was not strength, but precision. Mr. Finch, the storekeeper, came to his doorway. He was not a man given to easy mockery. He watched them for a long time, his brow furrowed. He saw the logic, the relentless, inch-by-inch progress. He saw the children working in silent coordination with their mother. It was not a scene of desperation. It was a demonstration of a plan. When they finally reached the cabin's cleared doorstep, Agnes left the stove on its rollers and walked to the mercantile. She bought a coil of asbestos stove rope and a small sack of refractory cement. Finch measured them out on his counter. "You sure about this stove, Agnes?" he asked, his voice low. "The firebox is awful small. It won't throw the heat of a standard box." "It's not meant to throw heat," Agnes replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. "It's meant to hold it." She looked at the materials on the counter. "It's a system." Finch looked from her steady eyes to the stove sitting in the yard. He did not understand. But he saw the way she said the word system. It was not a guess. It was a statement of fact he did not yet possess. He took her money without another word. Inside, the cabin's hearth was a wide, shallow alcove of fieldstone, stained black with the soot of countless inefficient fires. For a week, Agnes had worked on it, dismantling the front half and extending the stone base 3 feet out into the room. It was a low, solid platform, meticulously leveled. The neighbors had noted it. Another piece of the widow's strange puzzle. Now, its purpose was clear. The German stove needed to be in the center of the living space, not tucked away in a wall. It needed to radiate its heat in all directions. Getting it through the door and onto the platform was the final battle. They used the planks again, this time to bridge the threshold and the few inches of height to the stone base. It took them the rest of the afternoon, a grueling sequence of levering, pushing, and careful positioning. When it was finally in place, it looked like a black iron altar in the middle of the room. It dominated the space. Martha sat down heavily in a chair, her face pale. She did not complain. Agnes began the fitting. The stovepipe was new, a perfect circle of black steel. She fitted the first section into the collar on the stove, then another, angling it back toward the chimney flue. Where the pipe met the stove, she carefully packed the joint with the asbestos rope. Then she mixed the cement and applied a thin, clean layer over the rope, sealing it completely. Every seam was treated with the same painstaking care. When she was finished, she took a length of black thread from her sewing kit and tied it to a small nail she had hammered into the wall, inches from the main vertical seam of the pipe. The thread hung perfectly still, a dark line against the pale wood of the wall. Samuel watched her. "Why did you do that, Mama?" "To see the air," she answered. "If it moves, the seal is bad. We need all the smoke to go up. All the heat to stay in." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the motionless thread. The test was not of fire, but of stillness. The first fire was not for warmth. The day was still mild. It was a test of function, a diagnostic. Agnes laid a small pile of tinder inside the firebox, dry moss and wood shavings, and lit it with a single match. She did not pack the box with wood. She left the draft vent open only a crack. The kindling caught, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled up the new pipe and disappeared into the flue. She added 3 small, seasoned pieces of oak, no thicker than her wrist. Then she closed the inner door and latched the outer one. The children gathered around, their eyes on the thread. It did not stir. For an hour, the stove's surface remained cool to the touch. It made no sound. There was no cheerful crackle, no roar of a hungry fire. From the outside, there was no plume of smoke from the chimney, only a faint, shimmering distortion in the air above it. It seemed to be doing nothing at all. Rose put her hand near the side. "It's not working." "It's working," Agnes said. "It's just patient." She went about her evening chores. She milked the cow, prepared a simple meal, and helped the children with their letters. 2 hours later, she placed her palm flat against the stove's cast iron side. A deep, penetrating warmth had bloomed within the metal. It was not the scorching heat of a box stove, which made one side of a room unbearable and left the other freezing. It was a gentle, persistent radiance that seemed to fill the air itself. Martha, sitting in her chair, reached out and held her hands a few inches from the surface, turning them over as if warming them in sunlight. She looked at Agnes and gave a single, slow nod. The system was sound. The thread hung motionless. The house was sealed. Through October and into the first weeks of November, the valley prepared for winter according to its habits. The air rang with the percussive rhythm of axes biting into pine and cottonwood. Woodpiles grew into small mountains beside each cabin, impressive monuments to a season's labor. The smoke that rose from their chimneys was thick and constant, a dark gray plume that spoke of roaring fires devouring fuel. It was a visual measure of security. The more smoke, the warmer the home. Agnes's preparations looked meager by comparison. Her woodpile, tucked into a 3-sided shed she had built against the north wall of the cabin, was a third the size of her neighbor's. But it was different. It was composed entirely of oak and ash, hardwoods that had seasoned for 2 years. Each piece was split fine, no thicker than a man's arm, and stacked neatly to allow air to circulate. Most importantly, it was dry. The shed's roof kept off the rain and the inevitable early snows. The town saw her small, tidy pile and drew its conclusions. She was either foolish or lazy. She would be out of wood by January, coming to them for help. When her fire was going, the smoke from her chimney was nearly invisible, a pale, wavering breath against the sky. It signaled efficiency, not lack. She fed the stove twice a day, once in the morning, with 4 pieces of split oak, and once at night, with 2 larger logs of ash that would hold a bed of coals until dawn. The iron absorbed the energy, holding it, and releasing it slowly, steadily. The cabin was never hot and never cold. It was simply warm. The horses in her small pasture began to gather in the mornings with their hindquarters turned to the north, their tails to the wind. The cattle on the open range did the same. It was an old sign, one the animals knew better than the men. Winter was not just coming. It was gathering. It began not as a storm but as an absence. The temperature fell and did not recover. For 3 days, the mercury in the thermometer outside Finch's Mercantile dropped, settling into a place of deep, relentless cold. Then the sky, which had been a hard, metallic gray, began to release the snow. It was not the soft, fat flakes of a gentle snowfall. It was fine, granular, like sand, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a steady, mournful howl. The wind found every crack in every wall, every poorly sealed window, every chink in the mortar of a chimney. Inside the valley's cabins, the response was to feed the fires. Men hauled wood from their massive piles, stuffing it into the insatiable iron boxes of their stoves. The heat roared out, driving the occupants back from the immediate vicinity, while the far corners of the rooms remained frigid. Frost began to appear on the inside of the walls, tracing the lines of the nails that held the boards together. The wind pushed the smoke back down the chimneys, filling the rooms with an acrid haze. The battle was joined. For Agnes, the rhythm of life barely changed. The wind howled outside, and drifts began to pile against the windows, but inside, the air was still and warm. The thread beside the stovepipe hung as if painted on the wall. The stove's radiating heat created a bubble of calm in the heart of the storm. She had to add one extra log to her morning and evening feed. That was the only concession. The children played on the floor with their wooden blocks. The woodpile, protected in its shed, remained dry and accessible. She had ownership and availability. The men in town had ownership of massive, snow-covered mountains of wood they could barely reach, let alone carry against the force of the gale. Winter rarely missed such distinctions. On the third day of the blizzard, the wind reached its peak, a physical force that screamed around the corners of the cabin. The snow was no longer falling, it was a horizontal torrent, erasing the world, burying fences, paths, and ambitions. One by one, the plumes of smoke from the neighboring chimneys began to fail. First the blacksmiths, then the cotters, then two more down the valley floor. The faltering smoke was a signal of surrender. It meant the wood was wet, or the accessible supply was gone, or the fire had simply been lost to a downdraft and the cold was too deep to restart it. The silence that followed the cessation of a neighbor's chimney smoke was profound. It was the sound of a losing battle. Late in the afternoon, a heavy pounding came at the door. It was not the knock of a social call. It was the fist of desperation. Agnes opened it a crack. The wind tore at the opening, trying to force its way in. It was Mr. Finch, the storekeeper. His face was nearly hidden by a scarf crusted with ice. His eyebrows were white with frost. He did not look at her. His eyes darted past her, into the impossible warmth of the cabin. "Agnes," he said, his voice hoarse and broken by the wind. "Please." "My wife, the fire's out. My boy is sick. We're freezing." He still did not look at the stove. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge his own short-sightedness, the whole town's folly. He was not ready for that. He was just a man trying to keep his family from freezing to death. Agnes stepped back and opened the door wider. "Bring them," she said. The two words were all that was needed. There was no triumph in her voice. There was no "I told you so." There was only the simple, practical extension of shelter. Finch nodded, a jerky, grateful motion, and disappeared back into the white chaos. The stove glowed with a patient, steady heat. It waited. Finch returned in 20 minutes, his wife leaning on him, their young son wrapped in every blanket they owned. The boy's breathing was shallow and ragged. Mrs. Finch began to weep silently as the warmth of the cabin touched her face. They huddled near the stove, stripping off icy gloves to hold their hands toward the radiating iron. They did not speak. They absorbed the heat as if it were life itself. An hour later, another knock. It was the blacksmith and his family. Then the cotters. The small cabin began to fill. By nightfall, the last arrival came. It was Davies, the freight hauler, the man who had started the laughter. He did not knock. The door was already unlatched. He pushed it open and guided his wife and two small daughters inside. His face was a mask of grim defeat. He carried a single, frozen log, a useless offering. He dropped it by the door. He looked around the crowded room, at the faces of his neighbors, all gathered in the shelter they had mocked. His gaze finally fell upon the stove. It was not a joke. It was the center of their universe. Agnes's children, Samuel and Rose, sat on their small bed, watching the newcomers with wide, serious eyes. They made room without being asked, sharing their blankets with Davies's daughters. Samuel looked from Davies's face to his mother, who was calmly placing another log into the stove. He saw the man who laughed and the woman who worked. He saw the result. There were no words of apology, no speeches of gratitude. There was only the silent, crowded room and the steady, life-giving warmth of the German stove. Agnes moved through the space, ladling broth into bowls for her guests. Her expression was the same as it had been the day she unloaded the stove, methodical, focused, and uninterested in being understood. The outcome was the only explanation required. The blizzard broke on the 5th day. The wind died down and the sun emerged, shining on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white drifts and profound silence. The families left Agnes's cabin as quietly as they had arrived. They offered mumbled thanks, their eyes averted, and trudged back through the deep snow to their own cold, silent homes, to face the damage and the work of recovery. The cabin felt vast and empty in their absence. Life returned to its rhythms. Agnes cleared a path to the barn. She fed her stock. She refilled the wood box beside the stove. The event was not spoken of in the weeks that followed. When Agnes went to the mercantile, Finch gave her credit without her asking. He would look at her, start to say something, and then just nod and turn back to his ledgers. The debt was not financial. One morning in late April, as the last of the snow was melting from the shaded hollows, Davies's freight wagon pulled up outside her cabin. He did not get down from the seat. He just sat there for a long moment. Agnes came to the door. He nodded to the back of the wagon. It was piled high with seasoned hardwood, oak and hickory, split and ready for stacking. For the stove, he said. It was not a question. He climbed down, unhitched his team, and began to unload the wood, stacking it with practiced efficiency inside her covered wood bay. He did not ask for help, and she did not offer any. When he was finished, he hitched his team and drove away. It was the only apology he knew how to give. That summer, a new sound was heard from the blacksmith's shop. It was the sound of riveting and fitting, of men working from a new pattern. Finch had made a careful drawing from memory, capturing the design of Agnes's stove. He and the blacksmith were building one for Finch's store. By the time the first frost returned to the valley, 3 more of the stout, efficient stoves had been built and installed in homes. No one ever called them German stoves. They called them widows' stoves. The name was a quiet acknowledgement, a story compressed into 2 words. Years later, when Samuel was a man with his own cabin, his son watched him seal a stovepipe joint. He saw his father hang a single black thread from a nail beside the seam, checking for the movement of air. The lesson had been transferred. The knowledge spread, not through memory, but through practical gesture, a piece of iron, and a length of thread.